When a loved one dies, what support is helpful and why? Welcome to Finding Words in Hard Times, the podcast where we provide stories and tools to help you become more comfortable as you help others in hard times. I'm John Swanson, teacher, writer, and hospital chaplain. In this podcast and in the newsletter and in other places, I focus a lot on conversations following death. It's because the death rate's currently at about 100%. Um, when death happens at one of our hospitals um, in Northeast Indiana, a chaplain will come and talk to the loved ones. The conversations happened a little more than 5 times a day in 2023. 5 times a day, one of us walks into a room or occasionally makes a phone call and has a conversation that starts with some version of, "This is hard." And sometime in the conversation, it includes some version of, "When you're ready to talk about what funeral home you're using, uh, you'll let us know." Now, every one of those conversations is different, which means that each of those conversations makes us think, makes us hesitate, makes us wonder what to say. Every time we, even the people who do it all the time, um, every time we talk to a family, talk to an individual, we have to think because there's no formulas about what to say. And why is this? Because for most things in life, answers are complicated. How long will I grieve? How long will this hurt? Will this treatment work? And the answer is it depends. Depends on the kind of relationship. It depends on the suddenness of the loss. It depends on how many deaths you've walked through in the last days or weeks or months or years. All of those variables affect how people interact with a loss. So that's the question that I'm going to be talking about this week and a little bit next week. When a loved one dies, what support do people find helpful? Because as a hospital chaplain, it's a question that I ask myself often, and others ask me. We want to get that answer right. We don't want to mess things up. I have been offering and receiving support after the death of loved ones for nearly 8 years as a chaplain. It'll be 8 years first week of February. More than 20 years as a clergy member, decades as a human being. But answering questions like this is also part of my academic background. My PhD is in rhetorical theory and criticism. It's related to communication. I talked a little bit about it last week. Years ago, I taught public speaking. And since then, I have taught and I've written and I've managed and I've helped. I think about choosing words, about the effect of words, about the way that people will respond to words all the time, much to the chagrin of my family and my colleagues and my friends. Um, and I wanted to go beyond my experience and practices uh, as a chaplain to actually ask people about their experiences. What do people find helpful in the time of loss? So in August 2022, I created a survey for people who lost a loved one. Some of the people listening to this podcast may have taken that survey. What you know is I asked 4 core questions about people's experience after a death, what they found helpful in what people said, or in what people did, or in what grief support materials people gave them, and what people wish someone had said or done. So those were the 4 key questions I asked for demographics about loved ones and about them. I made the survey public to readers of my writing, and it was shared by some other people, notably by Dr. Lee Warren. And when I finally closed the survey, I had ended up with 155 full or partial survey responses, and the partial ones were completed enough that I could use that information. And 155 is not a huge sample, but it's enough for me to start looking at the patterns of things that people find helpful. And when I looked at the responses, I found 11 themes, 11 clusters of responses. Now, one of the things that was really striking to me was that there wasn't one answer. There wasn't one formula. We always say that everyone's grief is different because everyone's lost a different person, and it turns out that's true. And it turns out that when people think about what is helpful to them, there is not one answer. So when we try to apply one helpful thing to everybody, it's going to end up not being effective. Now, there are some things that more than one person said. And so here's the top themes. Um, People want to tell and to hear stories about their loved one. People want validation of what they're going through. People want orientation about what to expect to experience. People want presence. People want practical support. Those are where the top themes. Now, what that looks like is things like this. It looks like telling stories about the person or asking for stories about the person who has died. And I'll talk about that in just a minute, a little bit more. Being present, but not smothering, and let people know that you care in ways that they will hear as caring. Listening without offering answers or advice or comparisons, and being willing to be silent. Offering support in the weeks and months after the service. Lots of times people talked about getting support for the first 2 days, and then after that, everybody evaporated as they went back to life. So people want ongoing support. If people want spiritual care, it's okay to provide it, but think before using platitudes. Know that some people may be doing okay, all things considered. We expect that people will be having a hard time so that we can do something, and it turns out that some people are navigating the next steps without our help, which is a terrifying thought, right? Because we want to be helpful. Acknowledging that this is hard, that grief is real, that there isn't comparative loss. Providing orientation for next steps if you are knowledgeable. So, for some parts of the next steps, for example, at the hospital, I'm able to say, so one of the next steps is you're going to need to tell us what funeral home. So that's part of orientation. That's part of next steps. Identifying specific things that you're going to do and then asking before you do them. Like bringing food, mowing the lawn, preparing the house for company. And the last one of some broad overview observations is if somebody asks you to do something, do it. If they ask you not to do something, don't do it. All right. A couple of the preferences really stood out to me. The one I think that was most surprising when I looked at what people wanted was the idea of storytelling. First, people seem to want to tell stories about the person who has died. I mean, sometimes it's the story of their death, about here's what happened, and here, if it was a long, quiet death, sometimes they want to tell that story. Other times they want to tell the story of the crisis moment that happened. And it's a way of making sense, providing order in their brains about what happened. So in that case, um, listening to the storytelling um, uh, about the person is a huge and helpful thing. Um, sometimes uh, it's to talk about our connection to the person. So people want to hear stories about their loved one, stories that they didn't know. Recently, one of our coworkers was killed in a car crash along with his wife. It was one of those sudden, tragic, awful accidents. And a while after that crash, his parents came to the hospital cafe where he worked. They saw the grill, which is where he worked all the time. They went out into the parking lot and saw the parking space where he already always parked, which had been marked in his memory. Um, and they heard stories from coworkers about the way he always talked to kids, about the way that he engaged with people. For the parents, it was an incredibly helpful thing to hear that the people that he worked with cared about him. And for my coworkers who were telling me about the storytelling, it was a way of grieving, a way of shaping the story. For them, it let them participate by telling stories about this coworker. Um, and all around, the stories were huge. In that situation. And so I think that lots of times when somebody starts telling us a story about their loved one, about the death or about their life, we want to say, no, 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 I already know that. Or, oh, no, you don't have to talk about it if it's going to be too hard for you. Um, but in fact, often they want to tell that story to understand what happened. Um, in in my case, um, when our daughter died, there were a couple of things that happened at the time that I thought, oh, I should have done CPR, even though I knew I didn't need to. I should have done all these things. And it was in the last 2 or 3 years, so 30 years later, that I finally began to understand. And I finally took a chance to talk to somebody and say, oh, here's what happened. Maybe I shouldn't feel bad for not having done CPR. 30 years to finally have a chance to tell that story and to have somebody say, no, 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 you did fine. So storytelling can be huge. And related to storytelling often is the idea of validation. Um, People want to know that the pain that they are experiencing is valid, it's legitimate, it's normal. It's at the core of This Is Hard, that book that I put together. Um, what I realized after I wrote the book and published it, and realized it because of this research, is that This Is Hard period is part of the process of validation. It says to somebody, no, this thing you are going through, this is hard. Because we want to know that what we are experiencing counts as a difficult thing. We can have lots of interaction after that, but as a starting point, death and the death of a loved one is hard. Stop. So that's an overview of some of the things that people find helpful. I'll include links to more of that research in the show notes for this episode. And um, I'm wanting to do more research at some point soon, there's going to be another survey that's going to come out that's going to dig into a little bit more of um, the uh, the observations that I have. I want to validate them a little bit more. And in the next episode of This is Hard, or Finding Words in Hard Times, the podcast, I'm going to be talking about a model of bereavement, or a model of coping in bereavement, that has been shaping what I do. And so I'm not going to send out the survey till after you hear that, but I want to give you an understanding, a model that talks about bereavement that is different than the stages of grief model that so many of us are familiar with and so many of us are frustrated with. And so I want to make sure that my research is helping provide some validation for that model as well. So in that next episode, we're going to talk about that model of grief, the dual process model of coping in bereavement. And we'll be talking more about some research stuff, but I wanted to give you this overview of some of the things that I heard in my own research to help you as you're thinking of what can be helpful to people. So that's all for now. Thanks for listening to Finding Words in Hard Times, the podcast, where we provide stories and tools to help you be more comfortable as you're helping others in hard times. Take a look at the show notes, subscribe to the newsletter at thishishard.substack.com. You can see other links to resources in the show notes. And as always, thank you for working to be helpful. The people around you, the community around you, and me all appreciate it deeply. Thanks so much. See you next week.